We're focused on the future, and I'm absolutely confident that if we stay on this course, we can deliver a better and brighter future for both the Cuban people and the American people.
President Obama in Cuba, the first visit by a sitting U.S. president to the island nation in almost 90 years. Two countries rebuilding relations. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Long-frozen ties between the United States and Cuba continue to warm, with President Obama making an official visit to the island this week. This is the first visit by a sitting U.S. president to Cuba since 1928 and brings with it expectations and excitement. But the normalization of diplomatic relations has its stumbling blocks. Here with the latest, CCTV's Michael Voss. He joins us from Havana. And Michael, we've seen a lot happen already. What's on the agenda for the rest of the president's visit?
Well, very shortly they'll be sitting down for a state banquet, and that will be the final event of tonight. Perhaps the most important point of this visit, certainly from President Barack Obama's view, is on Tuesday morning he will give a keynote speech at the Grand Theater in Havana, which will be televised live throughout Cuba. He's going to lay out his vision for the future, how he would like to see relations develop, possibly how he would like to see Cuba develop. And I think this will be really an important moment for this trip. We're waiting to see eagerly how much he pushes, how hard he pushes Cuba on issues like human rights and democracy. Certainly so far, they've spoken a lot about it. They had an hour and a half meeting on Monday morning. Then they had a joint press conference. We heard a short clip from President Obama at the beginning of this program. It was interesting that both sides talked about positive developments that have happened over the past year, the deals that have been made, the areas of working together through areas of mutual interest like counter-narcotics and also trade and business. And then both sides also laid out clearly their differences. I think from President Raul Castro's point of view, often over the last year, Cuban officials have focused very heavily on the differences, the need to end the trade embargo, the need to give Guantanamo naval base back. President Raul Castro started his speech listing all the positives before going on to the more critical points. And he again said that engagement, learning to live, to work together and be able to have differences but not let them come in the way of a relationship was his position here. Then after Tuesday's keynote speech comes the relief at the end. You've got the baseball match between Cuba's national team and the Tampa Bay Rays. I think this is one thing that unites both countries and has done for many years. Cuba is absolutely passionate about baseball. Tickets to get into the game are really very difficult to come by, mainly invited people. We're waiting to see whether President Barack Obama will actually throw the first pitch.
Michael, when we look at these two countries and the restoration of relations, what are the major priorities, on the one hand for the Cubans and on the other for the U.S.?
I think from the U.S. point of view, at one level, it's a business, trade, economics. I think that from President Obama's point of view, he believes that if you can help and empower the entrepreneurs here, help develop a private sector with a middle class of Cubans who are not dependent on the Cuban state for their livelihood, then in the longer term, this could bring about change. He's also looking very much for business deals for American companies, be it trade or be it investments. Certainly some minor ones, one or two more important ones have been signed in the last few days. We've had an American hotel company is going to take over the management of 3 hotels here. Google is going to set up a Wi-Fi hotspot in an internet center here in Havana, offering speed 70 times faster than anything that's currently available in Cuba. Airlines, we're about to get scheduled flights from Cuba. I think from President Obama's perspective, the more business deals that can be done, the greater the cooperation there is, the harder it would be to make this policy of rapprochement reversible should there be a Republican in the White House. For Cuba, I think business trade is also an important factor here. Remember, it's been very heavily dependent for many years on help from oil-rich Venezuela. It's been receiving oil in return for doctors. Venezuela is in an economic and political crisis at the moment. The amount of assistance is coming through. I think Cuba is worried that down the road it may need to look further afield. And it certainly passed a new foreign investment law a couple of years ago. So I think this is part of President Raul Castro's attempts to expand Cuba's diplomatic reach out, to have new allies, to have new forms of trade and business. I think there's also a worry on the Cuban side that with all of this change going on, they don't want to lose the sort of the character, the exclusive identity of Cuba. They don't want to give up their ideology just because they're friends with the United States.
Thanks, Michael. That's CCTV's Michael Voss from Havana. Well, now joining us from Havana as well, Simon Marks is Chief Correspondent and President of Feature Story News. With me in the studio, James Early is the Director of Cultural Studies and Communication at the Center for Folklife Programs and Cultural Studies at the Smithsonian Institution. From Havana, Juan Triana is a Professor of Economics at the University of Havana. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Juan, let me start with you. What do you make of the visit by President Obama so far, and how have Cubans been reacting to it?
Well, I would say that by any point you can look at the event we are living right now in Cuba is very positive. And just about what Michael was talking, the Cuban private sector and how this will benefit the Cuban private sector, how it will encourage the Cuban private sector. In my opinion, something that both governments have been agreeing on since the very beginning, Cuba since 2010, is by encouraging the private sector through a package of reforms that we have been running since 2010 until right now. That's why the sector has been growing in more than 300,000 workers in the last 3-4 years. And we can see that through the 5 different package of reforms that Obama has been announcing since December 2014, most of them are related with encouraging the Cuban private sector. Right now is something that people here in Cuba are very optimistic about. It of course will help people here to move forward in terms of running their businesses. Of course, one of the big issues Cuba have always been facing is some restrictions from the USA blockade in order we can get some inputs and machinery and technology from some other countries and from the United States itself. And right now it seems that after these conversations, this is going to get better, it's going to improve. Right now we have to focus what is going to happen in the future, how are we going to make through all these announcements.
Simon, how do you think Latin America is looking at this visit by President Obama and more broadly at this restoration of diplomatic relations?
Well, you know, I think that's a very interesting question, and I mean, it was noted here in Havana that earlier in the week, President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela visited the capital here, and indeed images of Nicolas Maduro's visit to Havana have almost competed on television here over the last 24 hours with the images of President Obama arriving. Look, I think there is no question that the region recognizes that there is a slow thaw taking place in the relationship between Washington and Havana, but it is precisely that, a slow thaw, and you could really get a sense of that during the press conference that President Obama and President Castro held here a few hours ago. President Castro very much portraying himself as a committed Cuban revolutionary who remains ideologically at odds with the United States over a whole range of different issues, demanding that the embargo, what they call here the blockade, be lifted by the United States. And President Obama, just a few hours ago in an interview with America's ABC News, conceding that that is not going to get done before he leaves the White House in January 2017. So the Cuban government and many Cubans and many in the region can be somewhat skeptical about White House claims that this change is truly irrevocable, as they put it, completely irreversible. There are quizzical questions here about what happens if Barack Obama is replaced by a Republican.
James, more than 7 in 10 Americans support the restoration of relations with Cuba. How has that sentiment changed over the decades? You know, it's what, 5 or 6 decades that we're talking about here. How did Americans finally come to the realization that the blockade, the embargo, had not achieved anything, sanctions had not done anything, and how did they get behind Barack Obama on this?
Well, over the last number of years, first of all, many Cuban Americans have changed their views about a rapprochement with Cuba. There is a generational differentiation within Miami and New Jersey. A younger generation born here in the United States, their fealties are as North Americans, as U.S. citizens. Cuba is a construct to them, an emotional response on the part of many of their families, but as many of them will tell you, they go to Cuba, they come back after having seen cousins and the like and saying, well, you know, I'm actually an American, I feel my loyalties here. So we've had that change. We've had a more significant change, though, in the hemisphere, in which the United States has been told by the community of Latin American and Caribbean nations, all of the nations in Latin America and the Caribbean have said to the United States that unless there's a rapprochement with Cuba as a full partner in the protocols of nations of how we handle our mutual interests and how we handle differences, the U.S. will be left behind. It is the U.S. that is really re-entering the protocols of nations. Cuba has alignment with all of Latin America and the Caribbean. Brazil has put millions of reais into the development of the Mariel port, which is a deep water port. Nicaragua is building a deep water port with the Chinese. The United States is in crisis about deep water ports. Cuba is looking far ahead, and so I think we need to be cautious about a U.S.-centric view of what we would have the Cubans do, rather than the internal debates inside Cuba, which have been going on since Raul Castro was nominated as president by the National Assembly to be president. He said there's too little criticism in this country. He said to state officials, you need to be patient and listen to the citizens. He said to Grandma, the Communist Party major and sole organ, that you are not reflecting the views and the sentiments of the Cuban people. And he pointed out that you have an irony in Cuba. You have one of the highest educated populations in the world, as noted by UN stats. Their children score better than many of the development countries in math and science. It's one of the leading countries in the world in biotechnology. But the Cubans were producing nothing. So they are recognizing their own internal fault lines. Finally, he said, if that embargo is removed tomorrow, we still have our errors, our faults here in Cuba. So U.S. citizens need to pay attention to the internal mediation of Cuban citizens with their stewards of state and not put an ideological lens that everybody should act like America wants them to act. And so this 800-person delegation with President Barack Obama, mostly commercial, they are not really reflective of the broad diversity of ordinary U.S. citizens who have wanted a rapprochement, including pragmatic Republicans within the U.S. citizenry.
Right, that is a big delegation going with the president. Let's bring in Hugo Cancia. He is founder and editor-in-chief of On Cuba. Hugo, thanks for joining us. As James just mentioned, President Obama, accompanied by a huge delegation, many of them business leaders. You know, there is a perception there that this is going to change overnight in Cuba, that loads of American money is going to go in there for investment, that there's going to be a huge business relationship. Is that what you see happening in the short term?
Well, American money is already here. If you walk the streets of Havana or the streets of any major city in Cuba, all these businesses that are flourishing from one side of the island to the other, It's money coming from abroad. It's money coming from the Cuban diaspora in Miami to relatives in Cuba to build restaurants, cafeterias, gymnasiums, spas, even factories right now are being built with money coming from the diaspora. If you're referring to big money like Wall Street money, investment firms, or big corporation, I believe that's going to happen, but it's not going to happen as soon as we all are expecting, of the majority of the American people are expecting. Cuba, it's a communist country in transition. We're gonna have to allow some time for the Cuban people to jump into a different mindset and change the hearts and minds of the people. And that is happening. I think President Raul Castro and President Obama are in a mission of goodwill for better relationship between the two countries and opening for commerce between the United States and Cuba.
Juan, James brings up an interesting point here on how the restoration of relations is seen by Cuba and is seen by the United States. It's two very different things. What is Cuba's priority with the normalization of relations?
Well, my personal opinion, the restorations of the relations is something that have been quite positively talked about. Of course, Cuba still claiming for some things that we think are fair for us, like some of those that the president have been talking about, Guantanamo, lifting the USA blockade entirely. But we know that that is something that is not in the hands already of the American president by his executive prerogative. It's something that has to go through Congress necessarily. Nevertheless, we are trying to focus something right now that is more practical, something that we have to take care right now of, which is how to move forward about these new regulations. For example, the last ones that Obama just announced last week about allowing Cuba using dollars for our international transactions, how Cuba is going to respond to that. Cuba is very focused right now in trying to do those transactions to see if that really works, if we can move forward in that way. That will, for sure, positively affect Cuba. Investment here in Cuba, foreign investors coming to Cuba, even U.S. investors coming to Cuba, and that by any point will be something good for our economy. That by any point will be something that will build a good path to the one that Cuba and U.S. can keep talking and keep agreeing in some important points.
Simon, the economic embargo is still in place, and at that news conference in Havana, President Raul Castro addressed the economic embargo. Let's listen to what he said.
The blockade stands as the most important obstacle to our economic development and the well-being of the American people. That's why its removal will be of the essence, and actually will also bring benefits to Cuban immigrants who wish the best for their families and their country. In order to move forward with normalization, it will also be necessary to return the territory illegally occupied by the Guantanamo naval base.
Okay, so Simon, let's focus on the blockade for a moment. President Obama, as Juan just pointed out, cannot lift that embargo on his own. It's a law, it's U.S. law, it has to be lifted by Congress. But the president did say that he was pretty optimistic that it's going to be lifted sooner rather than later. Do you think his optimism is well placed?
Well, he said that the lifting of the embargo he thought was inevitable, but he didn't provide any kind of time frame for that occurring beyond saying that he doesn't think it can happen before he leaves office, particularly in an election year in the United States. So this is going to be an issue that in part gets determined by the outcome of that presidential election and by the occupant of the Oval Office, whoever he or she turns out to be. Let me just make one point, Anant, though, about the impact of the embargo, which President Obama described today as the Cuban government's last excuse for this country's economic difficulties. If you scan that skyline behind me here in Havana, you don't see very many cranes operating. You don't see very much indication of the construction and the development of business that we heard a little bit earlier in the program from one of our other guests is allegedly taking place. It's still very difficult to access the internet here. There aren't coffee shops on every corner. There aren't restaurants all over the place, chock filled to the brim with diners. I mean, there is economic dislocation here that that clearly is not going to be resolved until perhaps the embargo is lifted, and most importantly of all, until Cuba decides where it wants to get investment from, because the United States is facing competition here from other countries. China, President Xi Jinping visited in July 2014. Also Russia, President Vladimir Putin, obviously with a long historic relationship with Cuba. So the embargo is important, but it's not everything, and there's an enormous amount to do.
James, you wanted to say something about that?
Yes, I think we need to pay very close attention to the strategic storyline that the Cubans have laid down, and they continue to repeat this. The establishment of diplomatic relations is a major step forward. Normalization of relations ultimately will turn on the end of the blockade and the return of Guantanamo to the full sovereignty of the Cubans. They're also leveraging Barack Obama because he still has additional executive measures that he can take. It's one thing for the U.S. to be able to invest in Cuba. It's quite another to allow the Cubans to export here, which is not one of the things that the U.S. is allowing. So the Cubans are playing a long game, not a short game. And we have to realize that it's only been 15 months since this new agreement of the establishment of diplomatic relations. The other thing that we have to realize is that Cuba has, the U.S. policy towards Cuba, admittedly by the U.S. government, is a failed policy. Right. The Cubans have said, your failed policy will not dictate to us how we handle our internal mediations. There is a widespread criticism going on among Cubans, within the Cuban Communist Party, within various sectors of Cuba, about the absence of a more dynamic press with grandma, with issues of racism within Cuban socialism, with the need to really refine their really noted medical system. And the Cubans are having their own internal debate about how they want to handle what they call their own errors, their own failures, in addition to the imposition, negative imposition that has been put on them by the embargo. And so I think one of the major things that we should take away from here is to be very cautious about thinking that the world is going to be reflected based on the number of coffee shops that we have in Washington, D.C. or New York City. The Cubans are going to be very measured. They're going to keep their socialized medicine. They're going to keep their socialized free education. They're going to provide for small entrepreneurship. They're not going to allow monopoly. And they have a very well-trained statecraft corps. So when Fidel Castro is no longer in government, when Raul Castro steps down in 2018, there is a law that he promulgated. Cuban leaders cannot be in place more than 8 years. They're having other internal discussions about how they want to recalibrate their political system, but they're not going to peg that on what the U.S. wants. And finally, Malaysia is there, the Russians are there, Federica Mahari, I'm mispronouncing her name, the chief negotiator for the European Union, was just there a week ago. There's a rapprochement with the European Union. This notion that somehow the world will turn on the spirit and the eyes of the U.S. is one that we have to rid ourselves of, because we're blind to what is going on in the world. It's a multipolar world. It's no longer a unipolar world. And Cuba is reflecting that in its relationship with other countries.
Okay, let me get Hugo Cancillo's thoughts on that. Hugo, what do you make of the internal debate that is taking place in Cuba right now on this relationship with the United States, and indeed on its relationship with the rest of the world?
Well, first of all, let me agree 100% with what the previous comments made by one of our guests here in this show. Look, the Cubans have had the historical opportunity of watching very carefully and studying very carefully what happened in Vietnam, what happened in China, the transformation of all those political systems and economic systems. So they watched from abroad, and they have learned from their mistakes that have been made, and they're being very cautious. In 1959, the Cuba that existed in 1959, whether the Cuban businesses and the Cuban economy was in the hands of American businesses and American, many American businesses, that Cuba is not coming back. That Cuba is never going to come back. I'm not expecting to see 1,000 Burger Kings, 50,000 McDonald's around the nation, and 1,000 T-shirt shops along the Malecon. That Cuba is not going to take place. I mean, Cuba is now focusing on internal issues that are real issues that are affecting the Cuban people. In 1959, there was racism and segregation in this country. President Fidel Castro promised racial equality and social equality for all Cuban people. The first wave of Cubans that left the country were the wealthy class. all white Cubans. Moving forward to the mid-60s and early 70s, the middle class abandoned the island. Black Cubans decided to stay behind, not only because Fidel Castro was keeping his promise, but because there was racism and segregation in the United States, and African Americans were being lynched in Mississippi and Alabama and all over the country. So black Cubans decided to stay behind. The only small amounts of Cuba that migrated to the United States were during the 1980s, during the Mariel boat lift, which is when I left with my mother. So moving forward, during these economic reforms and the difficult time where Raul Castro is trying to push forward economic reforms and private entrepreneurship spirit, now most of the money that is coming to Cuba is money being sent from the diaspora, mostly white people, because blacks remain behind. Over 3 million Cubans living abroad, less than 1% are black Cubans. So those issues need to be addressed. And according to Cuba's last census, over 50% of the population today is black or mulatto. So those are issues that are internal issues that are the concern of this current government and the concerns of people like me and many other Cubans. And until those issues are properly addressed, I mean, I would not see any bigger opening or Cuba falling under the pressure of the American interests to establish businesses in Cuba. I want to preserve some of those social projects, free education, free health care, supporting cultural events and so forth in this country. So it's going to be a very slow process.
Juan, this visit is about the restoration of diplomatic relations. It's a start to normalizing the relationship with Cuba. What do you think are the main obstacles, besides the economic embargo that remain?
Can you repeat, please?
Yes, this is a first step in the normalization of relations with Cuba. What are the big remaining obstacles?
Sorry, I can't hear.
Okay, we'll try and get to you in a moment. Simon, let me go to you. Human rights was discussed by President Obama. Well, let's listen to what President Raul Castro had to say about it.
Defendemos los derechos humanos.
We defend human rights. In our view, civil, political, and cultural rights are indivisible, interdependent, and universal. Actually, we find it inconceivable that a government would not defend and ensure the right to health care, education, social security, food provisions and development, equal pay, and the rights of children.
So, Simon, did President Raul Castro manage to defuse that situation there?
Well, there was an absolutely extraordinary exchange in that press conference between President Castro and an American reporter who asked him whether he planned to release political prisoners here. And he stood up and said, "What political prisoners? If you give me a list of the political prisoners you're talking about, I'll make sure that they're released by the end of the day." So confident did he seem that the country did not, in fact, have any political detainees. But there were other scenes witnessed here over the weekend. The demonstration by the Ladies in White group, which takes place every Sunday here in Havana, relatives of people who have been jailed for their views, that got a lot of attention as that demonstration was taking place shortly before President Obama arrived here. The US president says that he is not going to hesitate to raise this issue of human rights. He'll be meeting with dissidents here in the morning. But he also has to know, Barack Obama, that the country has other foreign visitors from other parts of the world who are ready to engage with the Cubans,
right,
and who are not so ready to engage in a conversation with the Cubans about their internal political issues.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for. I'm Arun Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.